Heathens. Welcome. Hello. And my two guest heathens. Just kidding. I don't know if they identify as heathens, but you're here, you're heathens. Um, so I am clearly not in my normal spot. I am house sitting, which is why all of this looks different. I have my computer propped up on a pillow. It's just being as cozy as possible. All right. In any event, I am super excited because today I have Dr. Lynn Huber with me and also Dr. Stephen L. Young. And we're going to talk about the book of Revelation, which, if you grew up anything like I did, you're probably deeply traumatized by it. So we're going to talk about the different schools of thoughts a little bit. And then we're going to talk about some different perspectives that I certainly never had growing up when it came to the book of Revelation. And those will be like queer, feminist, postcolonial lenses, perspectives. I don't know. All right. On that note, I would like to have each of you introduce yourself a little bit. Let us know your backgrounds, however much of your background that you're comfortable with, and then we will go from there. Would you like to go first?
Sure. My name is Lynn Huber. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I currently teach. I'm the Maud Sharp Powell Professor of Religious Studies at Elon University in Elon, North Carolina. I think I have to say that title, so that's why I said it. They pay my salary. So, but I do New Testament and early Christian history, and my research is really on the book of Revelation. I grew up in an evangelical Christian context. I think that's important to know, and actually thought that the rapture was going to happen in 1988. I have my handy book, 88 Reasons Why the Rapture Could Be in 1988. The rapture did not happen in 1988.
Sure.
I'm pretty sure
I was
about
born
that.
the next year, so I don't think it happened.
So I was
maybe it was the Antichrist.
Maybe. Oh my. Yeah. All things have been answered now. Yeah. So I was going into my first year of college and was really worried about, the end coming and me missing out on college. I wasn't sure if I was going to make it or not in the rapture, because I was starting to have some, thoughts that weren't sort of aligned with my evangelical upbringing. But that's me. Maybe in a nutshell, I love dogs. I'm queer. I'm feminist. And my spouse is here with me on the other side of the screen. So you may hear some, I don't know, laughing
commentary.
At me. Yeah. Giggling.
That's awesome. I'm Stephen Young. My pronouns are he and him. I teach at Appalachian State University. I don't have a cool chair like Dr. Huber, though. I'm just a lecturer. But one cool thing, though, is that we live in the same state. And my family, actually, my dad's side of the family is from Burlington, which is right down the road from Elon.
That's where I live. I live in Burlington.
So, yeah, I'm trying to think. I work mainly on ancient Judaism and early Christianity. I'm late coming, my main areas of research, I study gender and mythology and gods in the ancient Mediterranean world and how they intersect and play together in early Christian and ancient Jewish texts. My first book that I'm finishing up now is actually on the Apostle Paul. I'm later coming to the book of Revelation. And true story, when I started studying the book of Revelation, to begin publishing on it, I basically sat down and read everything I could find by Dr. Lynn Huber, because seriously, her work is truly fantastic. And so I sort of feel like I don't belong on this panel with her, but it's been really exciting to dig into the book of Revelation. My approach to it was more coming from a background of like a scholarly background of studying ancient Greek and Roman and Jewish revelatory writings, writings where some sort of divine being is claiming to talk about some hidden wisdom from God. So Revelation just sort of jumped in there from that perspective, or from that vantage point for me. In terms of my background, I actually grew up in a not that religious household. And then when I went to college, I got in on the evangelicalism, fundamentalism stuff. And then I went to a deeply evangelical seminary after that, and then migrated away from that world later on. So I did not have the fun of growing up looking forward to the rapture. And then when I actually got into evangelical Christianity and what I call my previous life, it was in a Calvinist Reformed sort of area, and we tended to thumb our noses at the people who were obsessing over the rapture. So anyway, so we got a bunch of different backgrounds that are coming to play here right now.
Yeah, definitely. For those that don't know Digital Hammurabi, that's Josh Bowen, Dr. Josh. Yeah, another atheist channel that can't instantiate necessary properties of preconditions of necessities for possibilities of all beings. Thank you so much, Dr. Josh.
Yeah.
Okay.
And Revelation 2:22 is about rape. So, which Dr. Young, Stephen, do you mind if I call you Stephen?
If we're cool with first names, I'm good with that.
Yeah. I mean, has an article about violence in Revelation and how people kind of ignore some of the most horrible pieces of Revelation. So, yeah, we talk about, I think one thing we share is that we at least are trying to talk about and start to really talk about some of the parts of Revelation that people want to ignore, which are some of the pieces about violence against women. And
well, why would you start acknowledging violence against women in Revelation when you've ignored it for the other 65 books?
I know.
Why start here?
Yeah. And when you ignore it in real life, right? So ignoring, and I think
too real.
So I mean, that's not necessarily the place we need to start tonight's conversation.
Yes.
It is something.
I would definitely want to get into all of that. I'm not exactly sure. For people that are in the chat, I don't know how much people know just sort of like bare or foundationally about Revelation. So I was hoping what we could start off with was one, talking about the apocalyptic genre that it is written in, because I think that's really foundational to understanding the text itself. And then I don't think we need to get into like what happens in the book, because we'll get into some points as we're talking about it. But maybe we can briefly touch on the sort of schools of thought around the book of Revelation, how people have interpreted it. I know where I fall. I think probably where all of us fall, but that might be useful for folks. So why don't we start there?
Sorry.
Okay. Yeah.
Whoever wants to. I don't have like
an agenda that you sent us. So
well, I'm happy to start with just a little like nuts and bolts on Revelation. So Revelation, it's written sometime in the 1st century CE. People kind of debate like the actual date, but we know it's written during the time of the Roman Empire. It's written by a guy named John. He doesn't tell us much about himself, except that he's on this island called Patmos, and that he has a sort of revelatory experience. He's in the spirit. When I read it, I like kind of take that a little bit seriously, because I think, people, a lot of different religious traditions have ecstatic experiences. However, he does clearly reference, especially the Hebrew Bible prophets, right? He knows Bible and he's speaking Bible throughout the text. So, but it's written then to 7 communities, supposedly in the area of Asia Minor, which is modern Turkey. And it's writing to really specific communities, but we don't even really know the relationship John has to these communities, right? He could be somebody they like. He could be somebody that thinks that he knows them, but he doesn't really know them. And so, the relationship between him and the 7 communities is really kind of questionable. And Stephen, did you want to maybe talk about sort of the apocalyptic genre?
Sure. I thank you for that rundown of Revelation. So the word, I'm guessing many people here have probably heard the word apocalypse or apocalyptic before. In sort of modern, America, Europe, England now, when people hear the term apocalypse, my guess is that many people watching this probably think of the end, has the apocalypse come, something like that. And as nerdy scholars will point out, it's actually quite interesting that in the word apocalypse, excuse me, I'm sorry, actually comes from a Greek word. It could be a verb, it could be a noun, but the words in Greek don't actually refer to the end. They refer to the unveiling or the revelation. Like there's something that was hidden, now it's not hidden anymore. It's been revealed. And that's what it actually means in Greek. And when people refer to apocalyptic genre or apocalyptic writings, what's usually being referred to at a most basic level is a collection of, for New Testament scholars, we usually mean Jewish writings when we're talking about that, or early Christian writings. What's usually being referred to as a collection of writings that, at a basic level, claim to be revealing knowledge or wisdom or plans for the future from a deity to a human. Oftentimes, that revelation takes the form of someone, if you look at the book of Revelation, takes the form of someone like John, who is considered to be or presented as a visionary, who hears from an usually an angel or a lower level divine being, hey, here's a message from the heavens that's going to tell you about, and it can be about all sorts of stuff. It can be about what the mechanics of the universe are like and where the weather comes from and how many gates of the cosmos there are, what it's like if you're getting a tour of the heavens. Or it can be a revelation telling you about what's going to happen in the future. But it actually is sort of pretty evenly distributed between those two types of knowledge. And I don't mean to be boring, though. I'm just trying to sort of set the stage here that we have a lot of these writings from the ancient Mediterranean. Ancient Jewish writers were really into writing these. If you were interested in seeing one that is predating the book of Revelation in the New Testament, one of the classic apocalypses, or writing that sort of is this sort of revelatory kind of writing, is the book of Daniel, but very specifically Daniel chapter 7 through 12 in the Hebrew Bible. Is a classic earlier apocalypse. If anyone has heard the name Enoch before, we have a variety of apocalypses that are associated with the figure of Enoch. None of us actually think that a real person named Enoch wrote them, but when Jewish writers wanted to produce apocalypses, the name Enoch was one that they like to associate their writings with. So anyway, I'm spending a lot of time talking about this. Scholars have written endlessly about how to define an apocalypse or apocalyptic literature, but one of the key points here is that it's sort of this idea that something, knowledge that was previously hidden, is being revealed. I'm actually curious, Lynn, I might be forgetting this. I cannot think of any Jewish apocalypses where the visionary that's supposedly receiving the revelation is a woman. We have some in early Christian writings, but I can't think of any Jewish ones. In Jewish writings, it's Daniel, Moses, Enoch, Ezra, Baruch. I can't think of any women, but in early Christian sources, we have obviously John, or whoever's writing under the name of John for the book of Revelation. But we do have an apocalypse of Mary. Anyway, I just thought I'd bring that up. So
yeah.
You want to add anything to my rambling about apocalypses?
No, I mean, the one thing that I often say, and this is like, so, apocalypsis, the Greek word for that gets translated into apocalypse, is really like linguistically similar to the moment in a Greek wedding when a bride's veil was lifted. And so,
unveiling.
Yeah, it's an unveiling. So I kind of make a big deal about that fact, and that, the book of Revelation as Revelation is the first book to use that term.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it has something to do with like the bride at the end of Revelation. But it's also funny because you can make wedding jokes, like, it's like, right, like the wedding is an apocalypse kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So, I like to make a joke. So.
I'm going to try to make this digression randomly fast. I'm just going to bring this out because people in the audience might be interested. But just speaking of wedding jokes, in one of my classes is a class on marriage and antiquity. A couple weeks ago, I had my students read, and if anyone is interested, the earliest discussion of marriage in a writing about Jesus is Paul's letter, 1 Corinthians, in chapter 7. And so I have my students read it, and they go through and they look at what does Paul say about marriage, and really quickly what they discover is that he celibacy is best for him. Marriage is tolerable, but it's a lower level thing, and marriage is not for having kids. It is so you can, if you are a weaker follower of Jesus, you may get married so that you can have sex to eliminate your passions. Like if you can't control your passions, Paul offers sex within marriage to get rid of passions. And so the whole point of this digression, just because you mentioned marriage, is my one marriage joke the whole semester, except it's a whole class about marriage, is I say, so thus, when I proposed to my wife, I got down on one knee and I said, Deb, do you want to kill all of your passions for all eternity? You know, no more desire, ever marry me. And then anyway, I find that funny.
That is funny. I love
totally random. Sorry. Jessica, I didn't mean to digress. You looked like you were sort of lighting up at some of the things that Lynn and I were saying. Was there something you wanted to ask about?
Always. I love talking about Revelation and listening to people talk about Revelation. I don't know that there was anything. Oh, I remember. I was reading and I thought this was interesting. We don't have to spend a ton of time on it because I'm not sure it's super germane to like our larger discussion. But in the New Testament, sort of outside of Revelation, we see the authors using the Septuagint or like referencing it.
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen some authors or some scholars argue that it looks like whoever wrote Revelation might have been more familiar with sort of the Hebrew, and like was probably familiar with both, but we see certain verses that sort of have like word for word pieces, or words in Greek that seem like the author knew the word in Hebrew and then just assumed it had a double, like the same double meaning. So I think like the one where it talks about legs of like pillars of fire or something like that. Mm-hmm. And then the Greek word is actually translates to just foot, while the Hebrew word is leg or foot. I believe it's regel or something like that. So I just thought it was interesting because when we think about who wrote this book, the Greek is I obviously you guys could speak to this way better, but it seems like the Greek is pretty rough in Revelation compared to other parts.
It's horrible Greek, which makes it so much fun, but it also makes it so like I can't read any of the other books of the New Testament in Greek because I'm so attuned to Revelation's Greek, and it's so bad. A colleague that I went to graduate school with actually called it like Dr. Seuss Greek because it's kind of like got the rhymey scheme really going on. And John tends to write kind of like in couplets. So when you read it, like you kind of hear this really rhymey scheme. But I mean, we don't know if John like used the Septuagint. We don't know if he knew Hebrew. We really don't know. I mean, he is most likely a Jewish man or Jewish person, you know, who speaks Greek. And in Asia Minor, that's not unusual. But we don't know like anything about like whether he knew Hebrew. He does sometimes use terms that are kind of like transliterated Hebrew, where he's trying to like Harmageddon is kind of transliterated Hebrew. There are no direct quotes from either the Septuagint or the Hebrew Bible, really. And what?
But yeah, a lot of illusions.
Yeah, there's like really, you know, and he's just picking all the images. It's like a piecemeal thing, or it's like pieced together like a quilt. And so we don't really know like what he used, or what his first language is. But there's really great work by I think it's Alan Callahan on how like John is also like using this sort of bad Greek as kind of a strategy for criticizing the empire, right? Like,
interesting.
You know, instead of like, you know, using like standard Greek, which is literally the language of sort of the Roman. I mean, the Romans are using this Greek following like, you know, following Alexander the Great and Hellenism as a way of really uniting the people of the Mediterranean. And Alan Callahan is kind of like, yeah, it's like kind of a way of challenging the dominant culture, which I think is an interesting way of reading it. I don't know if I necessarily agree, but it's kind of about the language.
That might lead us nicely into sort of the second part of the first question, which is discussing the sort of schools of thought that have risen up around the book of Revelation, like how people have interpreted it or interpretive models. I know of 4. I don't know if there's more than 4. I wasn't raised with any of them, to be honest. But when I started doing research, then I found that there's these 4 interpretive models, but things may have changed.
Yeah.
So, yeah. I was going to let you, because I was looking at it. So for those of y'all who are following along, and I've seen these before, in New Testament.
Nobody else has the document except for us.
Yeah. So you listed the futurist model, the historicist model, the idealist model, and the preterist model. Sorry, I can't put these 4 fingers up at once. So decided 4, right there. So, Lynn, do you want to? I'm assuming this is something you go through with your students more than I do. So, do you want to take this?
Yeah, I can take it. Although I might just shift it a little. I mean, I might shift things a little bit. So yeah, there are different interpretive models. A lot of times people will number them, but they often kind of blur into one another. And these they're different ways of trying to make sense of how Revelation fits history in a sense. So there are some models of understanding the text that are really allegorical. And that's a really popular model of understanding it. That's been popular since the 4th century with St. Augustine, sort of reading the text as an allegory. And then you have people who are reading it really literally. And sometimes they're applying it to either, my spouse is laughing at something she's watching something else, and I don't know. I'm gonna have to throw something at her because she's distracted. There is this way of reading it literally, and sometimes people find different spots in the text where they align it to history, right? So for some folks, it's okay, most of the text is in the present, and for some more of it's in the future. And people have different ways of describing those interpretive models. And then there are some people who really believe that John is describing, and this is often described as preterist, John is describing things mostly during his day that are historical, but there's a sense that there's kind of a future realization of the things towards the end. So I mean, all of those ways of readings are just really trying to make sense of how the text relates to history in different ways. And all of them are ways that are sort of within the church, if that makes sense. Right. So they're all perspectives that think at some point that in some way this text is prophetic. So that this text is predicting things that will happen, whether it's allegorically or whether it's predicting things that are going to happen that are currently happening, or that they're going to happen way in the end, or they're going to happen tomorrow. So as scholars, we tend to not read the text in any of those ways, if you will. We tend to read it as a historical document, from the perspective of religious studies, as a document where John is trying to interpret what's going on in his world from what he sees as a heavenly perspective. Whether anybody else agrees with him, we don't know. I mean, some people probably agreed with him. That's why it ended up in the canon. But, as sort of scholars of religion, we don't necessarily read it as a text that's prophesying things that are going to happen in the future. Right.
Right.
And even though we might say, oh, this has relevance for thinking about things, we're not necessarily reading it as a prophetic text. Sure. So all of those are kind of prophetic ways of reading. I hope that makes sense. But
can I add something? I think that I love that how you piece that together. One thing I would sort of amplify that Lynn said is that, and I know we'll come to this later because I see that later on, I think we're going to talk about the question of symbolism in Revelation. I think one thing I often hear, Lynn and Jessica, I'm curious how often you hear this, is something like Revelation such a, it's just such a complicated and confusing text, and that's true.
Yeah.
But I think to pick up on something Lynn said, one of the another way that I like to think of this sort of distinction between what scholars are doing when we're approaching it as a historical text versus how many Christian readers are approaching the text. And by the way, we should be clear, there's a lot of overlap. There are a lot of Christian scholars too, right? And so, but the point is, if we're sort of taking those two like tendencies, if you're reading, I guess I'll put it this way, and here's how I'll try to explain to my students. If you're reading Revelation, assuming that it is true and that it must be talking about, something that's going to happen in the future or something that happened in the past, that makes the text a whole extra level of complicated, because it means that you are committed to Revelation speaking to something in world history, either back then, if you're a preterist, or for most Christian readers now or in the future. And so, I guess where I'm going with this is that's a layer of complication that actually isn't really there for people who aren't trying to make Revelation into something that's true, if that makes sense. Like that's actually something that makes it harder to read the text versus people from religious studies or history that are trying to understand Revelation as an ancient, revelatory text, or a text engaging in, all sorts of different ways that we study it. As weird as it sounds, like I'll just take for me personally, I'm not really concerned with the question of whether Revelation is true. And so even though the text is monumentally complicated and full of all sorts of things that we debate about as scholars, one thing that's just not on the table for certain types of approaches is a question of like, well, wait a minute, like those, the seven seals that are open, is one of them the European Union right now? Or it's like, is this referring to, are y'all felt like these are different ways that people have read the text? Like what year is this aligning with? That's not something that modern scholars are really, having to deal with when we're reading the text. And so I guess I'm taking you on to say this. One of the difficulties, I think, with parsing through the different approaches to Revelation, Lynn really identified, is that you have within theological and church camps a whole different collection of approaches as to like, is this predicting a rapture that's going to happen before a tribulation or after a tribulation? Or is the 1,000 years of Revelation 20 symbolic in the age of the church? Or is that something that's going to happen after? Like there's all those questions. And those are questions that are like really sophisticated readings, honestly, go into them within church settings. But that's a whole collection of questions that's only on the table if you're already deciding ahead of time that Revelation has to be true and prophetic. And if you actually strip that away, as weird as it sounds, I'm not saying that the point is Christian scholars can do this too. If you sort of strip that commitment away, it strangely enough makes it easier to just go sort of, how would this text have resonated for a first century audience, and start running.
Yeah. So I think like I've never needed to say like, hey, I fall into this school of thought, because like who cares? But I do think it's really interesting to do what I think everybody should do, and what people in religious studies do, which is to approach the text in its own context, in its own day and age, and with the audience that we, to the best of our ability, know it to be written to, or at least think it was written to, because that in and of itself will lend a lot of clarity, even though it's still very complicated and convoluted and all of this, when you're not trying to make it, like you both said, fit through history or fit to today or what's happening. And you take a look at the church in the first century and the issues that they may have been facing, and et cetera, like, I wouldn't say like, oh, that's the preterist way of thinking about it necessarily, but it does help sort of situate it and make sense of things that otherwise might not make a lot of sense. Right. But I think that we can actually wrap up this chat and pack it in, because Dan let us know that he was talking about China.
Right. Dan.
So that's, thanks for coming, everybody. No.
Can I, one of the things I want to say though is like in relation to this is that I think the historical context is really, I think, important to get a sense of. But I also really like thinking about how people have approached the text throughout history. In fact, Yeah. So some of my work has to do with how the book has been read in medieval and then in modern periods. And I'm just really interested in thinking about, I mean, in some sense, yeah. So there's a book that I wrote that does some of that. And I mean, one thing I think that's interesting is that people throughout history have really found meaning in this text. And I think a lot of the church prophetic models diminish that, right? Like if you think that the text is only about the 21st century or the 20th century or whatever, like I thought it was about 1988, then you're like diminishing like 2000 years of people who've been reading this text and finding meaning in it or like resisting it. And I think that that's fascinating. And maybe I'm a dork, but that's,
I think
know.
we're all
We're all
dorks.
dorks.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
but
and-
maybe we can talk a little bit about that then. I mean, like, why don't
Yeah.
we dig into that a little bit?
Yeah. So and I mean, so personally I'm really interested in like queer interpretations then of the text, how queer people have engaged the book, but then also how like in particular sort of people who identify as women have had visionary experiences of the text and see themselves and align themselves with John. Yeah, so that's my colleague Kay Ringelberg there. And so, yeah, I think, I mean, for me, that's an interesting piece, like that sometimes people are inspired by this text in ways that they actually see things along with John, and they do so in ways that sometimes take the book in entirely different directions than he does. So I don't know. I think
Can
it's
you tell us about one? I was looking for the commentary, but I guess I didn't realize, Stephen, I see the one you have. I was looking for the other one, but it's not out yet. So
no, it's not out. Yeah. So yeah.
can find
So
it.
yeah, the feminist commentary coming out hopefully in the fall. It's been done for a while, but it just takes forever. So like one of my favorites is this artist named Sister Gertrude Morgan. She was she is from the 80s because everything good happened in the 80s. And sorry. Yeah, you were born. But
no complaints here.
So but she was in New Orleans. She was originally from Alabama. She's a self-taught artist, but she's also a self-proclaimed like bride of Christ. And she really took Revelation and she ran with it as the bride of Christ. Like she understood Jesus as her husband, and she would talk in those terms, and then she would do art where she images herself as sort of Jesus's. Oh yeah, there's an image from the book.
I'm sorry, I'm not smart enough to figure out how.
But it's like she's in the wedding dress and Jesus is next to her. He kind of has like a porn stash, and but she like uses this imagery to kind of imagine like relationship with Christ. But then this sort of really interesting kind of, she's working in New Orleans in the Ninth Ward, and sort of calling people into relationship with Christ through the imagery of Revelation. And I think it's really kind of fascinating. That's one example. I mean, there's a lot of other folks who are inspired by Revelation. I've done some, I don't know, David LaChapelle. He's this queer photographer. He is inspired. He does a lot of things with like scripture, but including Revelation. Keith Haring, the pop artist, also has done he did an illustrated version of Revelation with the beat poet William S. Burroughs. And I don't know, people are really like into this.
It's interesting because for me, growing up in a very fundy setting, I was the opposite. I was like, this book is terrifying and traumatizing, and I don't even want to open my Bible to it because it scares me, and all I want is the chance to grow up. And before the show, I was saying that I used to pray. So like, for those of you that don't know, I'm pretty sure everyone knows, but just in case, the sort of very fundamentalist group that I grew up in was like, Jesus is coming back in your lifetime. Probably don't worry about college because like Jesus will already be back, NBD. like I was told from a very young age I was likely going to be like tortured and martyred for my faith. Like sick, I'm 8. Thanks.
The
Grew
things
up
we do to our children, right? Like,
right?
and to our friends and loved ones.
And I was like a super, like I started reading super early. I've always been like a voracious reader. And then, so what did my parents give me other than the Bible? DC Talks, Book of Martyrs, which is like
Yeah.
just porn.
Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah.
oh, sorry, it's like torture porn. That's all it is.
Yeah, no, it is. And I was showing her like my earlier my comic. There's a new world coming, which I can't figure out how to hold it up to the camera.
I was messing that up too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely prayed that Jesus wouldn't come back before I got my first kiss.
Mm-hmm.
And honestly, it's fine. He could have come back if he wanted to, but no. But so sorry. Anyway, also that woman's art sounds a lot like me growing up in purity culture and everybody telling me that Jesus could be my boyfriend.
Yeah,
which was real weird to me.
Yeah, I will say I see the resonances. Her like context is really different.
Sure.
You know, because she was an adult and she actually left her husband for Jesus. Which, you know, if you're gonna like, you know,
that guy's so mad.
I mean, and like I think it wasn't necessarily a good relationship. So she's not sort of like wasn't enmeshed in sort of the more recent white purity culture that we have, but the text does get used that way. And I grew up in a context too, like it's like, wait for Jesus, kind of, you know,
been waiting for Jesus for a really long time.
Yeah.
I was going to say something here.
So I guess scared of the rapture too. So
let's maybe talk about that. The rapture wasn't a concept until like 1860s, I believe it was. John Nelson Darby, is that the man who was like, hey, I know there's been like 1800 years of church history. Forget about it.
I'll actually start if this is okay, Lynn, and then you can take over to more specific. So again, I know we have an audience with a broad range of knowledge to bring to this. Many people have probably heard the term rapture before. So the idea of the rapture in modern Christian sort of theology, it's diverse. There's no one understanding of it, but basic idea is that the rapture refers to a time when Jesus, before he gets to finishing off all the final stages of his plans for judgment and Armageddon, things that are going to happen on the earth, he is going to rapture or suck all the Christians out of the earth, and what's going to be left are
Jesus sucks.
Yeah,
I said it.
Yeah, there we go. He's gonna remove them from the earth,
in the fun way.
And then other stuff's going to go down. And now, depending on which Christian theologians or leaders you're asking, that rapture can happen at different times. It can happen, you know, before a huge tribulation period of suffering or war. It could happen in the middle of it. That's why there are all these debates: are you pre-trib or mid-trib rapture? And so, but anyway, the idea of the rapture, and it's what's weird is that I'm going to say why it's weird in a second. The notion of the rapture is one of like the most commonly heard things when it comes to thinking about Christianity and end times. And then the fun part comes here is that, and I'm being serious, not that every Christian belief truly has to be taught in Bible. When you do religious studies, one of the things we learn is that the way people read religious texts tends to almost always be different than what those texts say in their historical context anyway, but that's cool. That's how humans read texts that are important to them. It's important. It's generative. It, you know, has a lot of deep meaning. So it's not like a bad thing. But anyway, this is interesting because for how important that the idea of the rapture is, it's truly not taught anywhere in any part of the Protestant biblical canon. The closest you get is in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, so one of Paul's letters, possibly his earliest. Paul is having a discussion about, okay, hey, y'all, I know you might be kind of concerned because some of you have died before Jesus came back, but don't worry, the people who have died are not going to be left out. When Jesus descends, everyone's going to be caught up in the air with him. And the idea he's saying is that like both the Gentile followers of Jesus who are left alive and the ones who have died, everyone's going to be united together. But since most Christian readers read the Bible and generate, like what Lynn was saying, we generate meaning in ways that tend to go beyond the historical meanings of a passage. one of the things that Christian readers tend to do is they piece one passage of the Bible together with lots of other passages in the Bible. So the idea of the rapture developed by linking that part of 1 Thessalonians 4 with a very specific reading of the book of Revelation that was associated with leaders like you mentioned John Nelson Darby, and the founders of what's known as dispensationalist Christianity. And then they link it with their various passages and prophetic literature in the Hebrew Bible, and they sort of put it all in a blender and mix it together, and you come up with an understanding of this rapture that's going to happen at a specific time. Maybe you can predict when it's going to happen depending on who you're talking to, but it's again, to me, this actually, and I'm not saying, when I'm saying it's not taught in Bible, that's not my way of trying to say it's wrong. It's my way of trying to say there are these really fascinating collections of readings and meanings that Christian readers have put together to come up with this doctrine. And it's, anyway, Lynn, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Before I pass it over to you, I had a quick question for Stephen, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on the use of the verb in that passage in 1 Thessalonians? Because I was reading that in the sort of ancient Near Eastern early Christian context, it would have been like when a king comes to visit his city and people like come out to greet him, and that very much would have resonated with people who thought that God was coming to sort of establish his kingdom on earth, as opposed to like you're going to get sucked up into the cloud. Like, no, Jesus is coming down here and we'll all meet him out beyond sort of the gates of the city, and then we'll usher him in.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, you're talking about the word that's usually brought up with is the Greek word parousia, which means appearance or coming. It's a noun. But
sorry.
That sounded really splainy. I did not mean for that too. This is just my nerdy brain clicking around. So the issue is that for those of y'all listening, this word that is usually translated in biblical texts, and especially in theological discussions of them, is the coming or the appearance of Jesus, usually the second coming. There's this Greek word, parousia, and we have, Lynn, you probably know more about this than me. We have some inscriptions from the ancient Mediterranean that describe the arrival of a Roman emperor to a city using this Greek word. And so that there are several New Testament scholars, and then especially church readers who are trying to generate interesting meanings based on this, and will say, look, depending on how you understand this word, it's possible that when writers of the New Testament use this word to refer to Jesus coming, they're trying to in some way invoke the idea that, hey, it's like the arrival of an emperor. And then the question becomes whether, for example, it's saying, yeah, this is Jesus, he's the real emperor and he's setting up his own imperial theocracy, or some scholars take it the other way and say it's subverting ideas of like Roman imperial power. But the bigger question is just whether when that word is used, there's a resonance for Roman emperors. Some scholars go on further and say, look, there's a script when an emperor arrives at a city, people go out and meet him outside the city, then they proceed into the city with him. And so maybe when this word is used, Jesus' second coming, it means it's going to be a kingdom that's set up on earth because people go up to meet him and then they come down to earth with him. And that's actually one influential reading of 1 Thessalonians 4 associated with scholars like N.T. Wright, for example. I personally don't go with that reading, but that's also a picky way of reading Paul personally, is that I go ahead.
Sorry. So, and I don't know how to pronounce Greek at all, but I was just checking the notes that I had, and the word that I have is, the Greek word is harpazo for caught up. Maybe I'm just.
Are you talking about for 1 Thessalonians 4? Okay, yeah. So that I wanted to parse it because that's the word that tends to be associated with emperors.
Okay.
Lynn, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I'm not familiar with any discussions that associate that verb with emperor arrivals anywhere.
I don't know. I don't know.
I'm not a scholar. This is just stuff I picked up as a reading.
The discussion of emperor. That the verb that's used there is not it's not. I'm not to put this like when you read text, words mean something in context, right?
Sure,
so you can always debate and discuss what the nuance of a word is. That particular verb is not something that a lot of debate really clusters around, though.
Okay.
There's debate in the sense of like what's the larger scheme that might be envisioned, but just the general idea of like being caught up or sucked up. Yeah, that's not something that, to my knowledge, and I could be missing it, tends to get injected with emperor meanings and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
But that's not again meant to be slanted. This is fun. All these are complicated texts, so it's.
No, I didn't take it that way at all. I was just teasing earlier. Yeah, sorry, Lynn, do you have anything you would like to add there?
No, I'm sorry. I wish I did. I don't. No.
That's okay.
What I think is interesting is that interpreters do take these texts like Stephen was describing, and they put them together in really interesting ways. It's kind of like code breaking, right?
Yeah.
And I will say, when I grew up in an evangelical context, that was part of the appeal of things, right?
Goddamn Rosetta Stone.
I know, it's like a big puzzle. And
if you go with every 73rd letter, like
I know. And so if you're kind of a precocious person, who's like, it kind of just like grabs you in a way, because it's like, oh, putting all these things together and trying to figure things out. And so like, I get the appeal. And
our brains like to generate meanings, when we read stuff, and it's cool. I just totally, another random thing. So when I got to the seminary I went to after college, you had to pass a Bible exam. And the one that they were using when I got there was an exam from, and this will mean something to some of the audience, it was an exam written by dispensationalist theologians, which is funny because the seminary I was at, Westminster Theological Seminary, was not that way at all. But I think the idea was they needed a Bible exam. They went and found one that had a ton of questions, and they didn't, rewrite it themselves. So I remember sitting down to take the exam, and I was like, like if y'all think you were dorky, like I was at this point in my life for the previous couple of years, I've been waking up at like 5 a.m. to read.
I believe you are the biggest dork here, Stephen.
Thank you.
Me too.
I appreciate my life. But I was waking up, like 5 a.m. to read the Bible all the time. So I was like jazzed to take this exam. I was like, I'm going to do well. I'm going to try to pass it. Anyway, so I was going through it. I was having fun with the questions, and I got to this one question that said, in what book is the vision of the heavenly post-rapture temple? And so I was sitting there, right, Lynn, because I was sitting there going like, there is no writing in any Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, New Testament that does that. And then it took me a second because I had to start trying to piece together, like what you were saying, like how would the people who wrote this exam have come up with this? And I was like, okay, so these are people who believe in the rapture. They are understanding there being a temple afterwards. Where would they get that? Oh, I know, Ezekiel 40 through 48. But the point is Ezekiel says nothing about a rapture or anything like that, but it is a vision of a temple, and so it was one of those things. It was just like what Lynn said. I had to like piece 5 different biblical writings together in my head to realize how they were making those connections. But for that
Stephen,
question,
the Bible is clear.
Yeah, but for the question, it was presented like it was just a straightforward thing.
Of course. Because nobody else thinks differently than dispensationalists. They think we're right, therefore everybody.
Going to something Lynn said, one of the cool things about how, and I know you have specific revelation topics, one thing that I think it's easy for us to forget when we're sort of in dorky, nerdy ways, really zooming in on what does this text mean in this context? What does this one mean? How have people put it together in ways that it didn't mean back then? One thing that's easy for us to forget, though, I think, is that we all exist in like ways of reading texts and collections and pastiches of them that we inherit that we're not really that aware of, right? And so something that a person from a different community would look at and go, it makes no sense. For other people, it's like, well, obviously that's just how you read it because they grew up hearing all those texts read together. But that's not like, none of us exist outside of that, really, to my knowledge.
Right. So because we have the privilege of having somebody who reads and studies Revelation through lenses that I've never read or studied them through, and because I want to be respectful of everyone's time, Lynn, can you talk about what it means to read the book of Revelation or to study the book of Revelation through a queer lens or a feminist lens or a postcolonial lens or all of those together?
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, and this kind of gets at what Stephen was just saying, that we all sort of bring with us like all this baggage or these sort of lenses that when we read the text. So everybody has a lens when they read a text, and just in some interpretation, some types of interpretation privilege naming that. So when I'm doing sort of a queer reading, I'm privileging sort of looking at the text with like a commitment to people within the LGBTQ plus community, queer readers. And I'm also read with the assumption that gender is everywhere. Gender and sex is like throughout everything that we do, and that those are socially constructed, and that they're often socially constructed to support sort of heterosexist, cisgendered perspectives. So I'm privileging that those are the things that I tend to be looking for. And then as a feminist reader, I'm also doing kind of the same thing, but looking maybe more for, how the text, um, creates gender. And again, sort of in my feminist perspective means that I'm really privileging how this text has impacted the lives of women. And I mean that like all women, right? And how it kind of how it creates sort of gender and how it impacts the lives of sort of that women live even today. And so I'm interested in how the text constructs patriarchy, how it participates in that, how it replicates sort of first century assumptions about sex and gender and then brings them into the 21st century when we don't read the book critically. So those are the questions I'm really interested in.
Let's talk about it.
Yeah.
Really, if we could dive into any of those things, but maybe like what gender roles are replicated, even though I think if you've read the book, most of us kind of have a feel, but like what gender roles are replicated. And I think, Stephen, I believe you've done some writing on sort of how harmful the text is to women. So if we could talk about how it replicates it and then how that's impacting really whoever, women throughout history, women today, all of us. I just would like to listen.
Well, one of the things that I'm really like into arguing recently, so like some of my first work really focuses on images that are gendered with sort of a feminine gender. And that, was where I was when I was reading when I started my working on Revelation. I was really interested in feminine gender. I was really interested in the wedding imagery. The fact that I was also coming out queer probably is connected to that, right? But now, the whole book is gendered. Like everything in this book for me right now is about, my sense is that John is really constructing a certain kind of masculinity, and that he's really trying, and this builds upon the work of someone we all like owe our feminist revelation credentials to, is Tina Pippin. Tina Pippin's a major scholar down, and she teaches at Agnes Scott College. Really important person in our field. But the whole book is about sort of constructing masculine gender. Death and Desire is her sort of classic book. So the book is really trying to create ideal men, even though John may realize that people in his audience aren't all men. But he uses those kinds of ideals to shape what he thinks his audience should be and how they should act. And you see that in every part of the book. When you start to read it, you just can't miss, and then he uses these, feminine images or these images of women to kind of shape then his audience's ways of thinking. And so, and those are some of the images then that get attached to women in real life, even though the whole damn book is about gender.
Yeah. I mean, I've had people on the internet tell me I'm the whore of Babylon.
Yeah.
Which I'm like, thank you.
But I know. I do have a piece where I talk about how like I'm like enamored as sort of a lesbian feminist queer reader. I have an article about how like that's an appealing image.
Sounds like a bad bitch, honestly. Like,
no, exactly.
she's
right?
not playing around.
Queer figure. So yeah. But Stephen has a great, again, like you mentioned this piece about like, how it gets, how the text gets used against women.
Well, and I want to clarify this. I said this earlier, and I wasn't just trying to like say nice things. So, in all seriousness, even though I've like the study of gender in ancient Mediterranean texts is something I've been playing with for a while. When I started wanting to look at sort of the intersection of the questions that interest me in the book of Revelation, like gender and how gods are talked about, and how like writers combine those things to promote or empower or naturalize the authority of certain groups of people and not others. I honestly, I went to your work first, Lynn, because I knew you had been thinking about this very deeply for a while, and then Tina Pippin's work, obviously. And just to clarify, because there's this is a massive movement in scholarship on Revelation that's been taking place, and I don't know if you could, like, when you would date that, but I mean, my impression just from looking at work is that it makes, if you're digging into the book of Revelation now, like if anyone's wanting to start nerding it up with Revelation, doing it now versus 30 years ago is a completely different world, it looks like. Because, and one thing I was just going to add, not to like try to sort of to amplify something Lynn said, when I was in, like when we hear people talk about feminist or queer approaches to the text, when I was at the seminary of my previous life, when I heard that term, when I heard a queer or feminist approach, what I heard was people saying, hey, I have interest in feminist and queer stuff, and I'm going to pretend the text says this even though it doesn't. It's the type of thing I had heard before. And then one of the things when I shut up and started listening and learned over time is that, you know, as Lynn said, this is about asking the questions that readers bring, but also it's about us attending to things that we had not attended to before in the text. And when you study, I'll try to tie this all quickly, but when you start studying gender in the ancient Mediterranean, as I teach my students, one of the things we learn is that most of the writers we have who are like elite men or the slaves that they owned who helped them write texts or the people patronized by the elite men, one of the things you learn though is that when they are writing about just about anything, they tend to be involving ideas of gender. And so a classic example would be what we think about is stuff that doesn't have anything to do with gender is explicitly gendered in ancient texts, right? And so a classic example would be one of the ideal virtues in ancient Mediterranean writings is self-mastery. We usually translate it as self-control, right? And, you know, Lynn especially is smiling here because she's written on this, right? Like self-mastery is the idea that the virtue is you can control and moderate yourself, and that's obviously a great virtue to have. You're not controlled by your passions and emotions, you master and control them to live a well-ordered life. But the people who wrote about this turned that into a political ideology. Why should a certain type of man, be in charge of ruling? Because he is self-mastered, which means he can rule over himself, and that makes him qualified to rule over everyone else, especially women and slaves, who cannot rule over their own emotions because
have they met men by any chance?
Thing. Well, sorry.
I said, have they met any men by any chance? Like
No,
men are not notoriously self-controlled.
Yes, there you go. I know my students make the same joke when I'll assign text that'll talk about this, but like that's an explicitly gendered thing because the entire matrix is it is masculine to be virtuous, it is feminine to be vicious and not self-mastered. So the next book project I'm actually thinking of doing, and then I plan to be coming to you to ask some questions about this, is a project that I've tentatively entitled The Gender of Salvation in Early Christianity.
Ooh,
but one of the ideas is that, and scholars know the first thing I'm going to say here well, is that a lot of sources we have when they envision someone becoming more like God or more pious or more like Jesus, that's a masculinizing thing versus if you're sinful and vicious, that's feminine, right? And so anyway, that's what I just want to say, like, to clarify and just to amplify what Lynn said, is that when you approach Revelation this way, when we're saying that everything is gendered in it, doesn't mean that like literally every passage is explicitly saying women, men, or naming women and men, but it's like when it's describing Jesus, it's using all of these traits and characteristics that resonate loudly with masculinity in ancient sources. And then when it's describing the people Jesus is going to punish, they're feminized, and they're described in ways that stereotypical women are described. And this is actually something where I know we keep saying, but Lynn's work has been particularly helpful on, like your work on how the different women, and there aren't that many in the text of Revelation, which I'll let Lynn speak to in a minute. But to finally get to Jessica's question, the article that they're talking about it's on Revelation chapter 2 verses 18 through 29, and it's one of Jesus's 7 letters to 7 different assemblies or groups of Jesus followers that Lynn mentioned earlier. And in this letter is where you get the book of Revelation, or the writer of Revelation, mentioning a teacher that he glosses with the name Jezebel. And he's very angry at Jezebel because the argument in this letter to this church is that, hey, y'all, and this is supposed to be Jesus's voice speaking. It's actually said it's the Son of God speaking to you. And it says, hey, y'all started out really well. You were pious, you were awesome, but I hold this against you. Now you've declined. Now you've started listening to this teacher Jezebel, who's leading you to eat food sacrificed to idols and to engage in bad illicit sexual practices. And she's deceiving you, which is another classic term in Jewish writers that's associated with women. And she's deceiving you. But then this is where the text, and we need to issue a content warning here because this is about to get very dark very, very, very quickly. The Son of God says, I'm going to punish her by, and it's usually translated as, I'm going to throw her onto a sick bed and I'm going to murder her children. And now that's bad enough already. And one of the points that Tina Pippin made, this feminist scholar of Revelation that all of us sort of descend from as scholars in some way, is Tina Pippin's point, and she actually accepts that reading, that Jesus is going to punish Jezebel by throwing her on a sick bed and thus making her sick and murdering her children. But Tina Pippin points out, hey, the usual readings of this text are glossing over the fact that we have extreme violence against a woman taking place here, and that's something we shouldn't ignore. But then other scholars have come along, including Lynn and Sarah Emanuel, who's a fantastic scholar of Revelation now, and David Frankfurter and Colleen Conway. I'm just naming if people want to look these up. And argued, hey, in fact, the word in Greek there isn't sick bed. It's just a word for a bed. And there's literally nothing in the context of Revelation 2:18 through 29 that suggests sickness. So there's nothing that would ring the bells of the bed being associated with illness or sickness. What instead we have here is a context where the writer of Revelation is saying Jezebel has been engaging in all these sexual misdeeds. Then Jesus says, I'm going to punish everyone according to their works, or as their works deserve. And then what he does is he violently throws her onto a bed. And so when you put this together, and then this is what I sort of add in with to sort of enhance this reading or build it or develop it more in my articles, when you put this together with all the military sort of imagery or warrior imagery that's used of Jesus, and imagery of conquering, like the followers of Jesus are called the ones who conquer. Here, when you put all that together, what it looks like is that we have a classic script from ancient sources. One of the most common settings of rape in an ancient text is when a victor or victorious army rapes the survivors that are left there and then decimates their lineages. And so this looks like a classic example that we have throughout ancient literature of a conqueror who is punishing his defeated enemy with sexual violence and then decimating her lineage. And so, as I said, this got dark fast, but it's this is one of those.
Welcome to the Bible, baby.
What was that?
I said, welcome to the Bible, baby.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so this,
Many. Yeah.
It's not super lighthearted.
yeah, sorry, I've said enough here. I'd love to hear how Lynn wants to develop this, because Lynn has talked about this reading before, and I know you have written extensively on the different women in Revelation, but this is notable here because Jezebel's the first named woman in the text. Is that right?
Yeah. Although one of the things that Sarah Emanuel argues is that it might not, and is not the only person who does this, but is that Jezebel might not be a woman, right?
Yeah. Christ teacher.
Yeah. So some people are like, oh, look at, maybe this is a reference to a possible, early woman teacher who's also working in the same areas as John, and he's really pissed off at her,
That's Robert Whitaker's argument.
Yeah. And so another way of reading it is then what Sarah Emanuel kind of argues is that John is using feminizing language to, call a male fellow teacher in the area, to castigate him by calling him Jezebel. So, the gender, how gender is working there is really interesting. Another colleague of mine, someone I went to graduate school, Juan Hernandez, does text criticism, which is looking for like places in the manuscript where people, right, have changed things. And he's found a manuscript, like one manuscript where a scribe like changes the language so it's not Jesus, I think, or something like that, which is interesting. Where like, you know,
Yeah.
somebody
so
was
you're saying the scribe
uncomfortable.
changes it so it's not Jezebel in the text; it's a masculine name.
No, where somebody changes so it's not Jesus doing the throwing.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. Or the raping.
Mhm.
Yeah. So, yeah, but it's just like one thing. And I'm not sure if he's written about it, but it's interesting reading.
I do. So one thing I want to say is if whoever's noticing me in the audience, like rolling my eyes, I'm not rolling my eyes at Lynn. I'm rolling my eyes at like the way in which even thousands of years ago, we're still using female or feminized language as a pejorative and as like the worst
Right.
possible thing that you can call somebody else. And it's
Yep.
like, it's still the same. I talk about this all the time.
Right.
But
Yeah.
the other thing that I have been dealing with recently, which is no surprise to biblical scholars, but it's the just like incredibly casual way that the Bible discusses violence against women. And it's so normalized. And then like it just continues to, one, I mean, it obviously feeds into modern Christianity, but like modern Christianity in America has become so enmeshed with also culture at large that this violence against women that's sort of normalized in the Bible, it's not, the violence against women in our society is not fully rooted in just the Bible, but like it definitely plays a role in how casually we use things like rape, for instance, when we're discussing like philosophical questions, right? When we're like, let's create this situation, and you have like philosophy bros that have taken like one half of ethics 101 that want to talk about like, well, what if, you know, X, Y, or Z? And it's always violence against women or violence against women and children, right? And as soon as you say like, well, why don't we just make the victims male? They get really mad. So it's just interesting how there's this normalization in the Bible. And I always think when we're talking about it, like I like to just make that point because growing up in the church, violence against women, it was so just like, I didn't even think about it. It was just like, okay, you know, like we have like Judges 19 where I was just like, that's a thing that happened. Okay, got it. And then I never thought about the fact that like, that's insane. Like, but anyway, sorry.
No, I mean, I think it's tied up in not just the Bible's use of violence against women, but also the making women into objects. So one of, you know, so some of my work on Revelation has to do like, you know, we have this image of the great prostitute, and then who's Babylon, who's a city. We have the image of the bride of the Lamb, a New Jerusalem, who's a city. We have these two images, right? Women, the depiction of cities as women is really typical in the ancient world. And we see it also in the Hebrew Bible, right, with Jerusalem. And that's where, you know, the idea of war and rape, which Stephen was talking about, get mapped metaphorically onto each other, right? So, like, you know, a woman is a city.
To be conquered and pillaged.
Yeah, exactly.
And
so
break
a
down
city,
her walls.
yeah,
right. And usually because the city was being wicked in some way or was like needed to be punished. Sorry, I'll stop interrupting.
Well, no, and I think, you know, I hear a lot, like I'm hearing more and more like people often referring to objects as women. Like, so I mean, we have this whole tradition, right, of describing cities as women. People describe boats as women, cars as women. People talk now about like, you know, outfits as women, right? Like my t-shirt, she's so cute, right? Or my hair, she's so cute. You know, like this is such a and I mean, I hate, so I'm always like, I'm a lot of fun at parties because I'm always like saying, you know, like I don't appreciate that. The sort of like reference to objects by gendering them as female, right? Or using feminine gender, because, you know, of this whole, turning women into objects. Then objects can be acted upon by men in a variety of ways, including in violent ways. And yeah, that it's ubiquitous in our culture. And it was ubiquitous in Roman culture. So it's not only Christianity,
Mhm.
but Christianity became the vehicle for spreading this sort of ancient, is that a dog? I'm so
It
excited.
is, sorry.
Oh, I love dogs.
Get up here.
Oh, is that a golden doodle? Now I'm really excited.
Yes, he is. This is Charlie. He's one of my here. Charlie.
Hi, Charlie.
Hey, Charlie.
Oh my gosh, I love Charlie. But yeah, it just, Christianity became the vehicle for spreading this throughout the world through as they colonized nation lands that they imaged as women.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, it's all the patriarchy goes all the way down, right? And
yeah. Well, and I think probably the three of us, and maybe some people in the chat, realize how incredibly damaging it is when you start treating objects as a gender, because it normalizes sort of this idea. They bleed onto each other, right? So if we're calling a bunch of objects she,
women,
her,
she,
women, whatever, and we're associating a lot of very specific qualities with those objects, there's a reason we're doing that, right? It's because we associate those qualities with the gender that we are using. But it also starts to blur the lines between like what really is an object and what really is a human. And especially in a culture that already objectifies women from birth. It's, I think, really important to make that distinction and to do what we can to not allow it to be so normal and normalized and just happening everywhere all the time, because people might think like, it sounds silly, why do you care because like over time this has very real repercussions for our society and for all of us, really. But
right, yeah,
anyway,
no, I agree.
So I had, if I can jump for 1 second, I had a moment, like, when we think about like our own development or changes or whatever in life, oftentimes the narratives we tell simplify things that are really complicated and many years and whatnot. Anyway, there was one thing that was not like a moment that changed everything, but it's something I often look back on. As I was at when I was sort of on my way out of the evangelical world, I was attending this church in grad school. There was like, they would have considered themselves like an egalitarian or feminist evangelical church would have been how they positioned themselves. Unfortunately, still very homophobic, but they would have considered themselves as, like trying to stand up for women. And the pastor there one Sunday preached a sermon on Deuteronomy 21, verses 10 through 14. And now this is content warning time again. This is a collection of a law in Deuteronomy about when the Israelites are genociding a town that is outside of their land. They can leave the attractive young women alive, and the men can take them as wives. And so this is a scenario of kidnap rape. And then if they get sick of them, they can enslave them. They have to send them away. Which, if you think about it, that's effectively a death sentence, right?
it's a death sentence, yeah.
Their entire support network has been destroyed and they're being sent away. Anyway, but so it's this reprehensibly like dark, terrifying passage. And so the minister just chose to preach on this one Sunday. And in his message, what he was trying to do was say, like, look, even here, God's trying to meet you. And so he was trying to like preach a message where he thought he was trying to show that there's more compassion here. And even though this passage looks really bad, it's not as bad as it looks. And he tries to talk about how it's really a compassionate passage, which is false. Anyway, all this is to say, for me, that was actually a really interesting moment, because prior to that in my life, I wasn't at this point then, but I had a long period where I was really committed to the idea of like, look, I'm a conservative Christian, but I want to be a feminist too. And so I had this phase where I was trying to argue that like the Bible really wasn't, patriarchal. It wasn't violent against
women.
We all? And then I eventually,
we all have that phase.
Well, then for a lot of reasons I shifted away from that, but part of that was because I started studying the ancient Mediterranean. But so I understood where he was coming from. But the moment I had there like really crystallized it for me, because I walked up to him afterwards and I said, look, there were more than 3 women in this room. So odds are that we have women in this room who are victims of sexual violence. And there are many more than 3 women in this room. So like there are a lot of people in here who identify as women. Many of them are probably victims of sexual violence. And you just told them that what happened to them wasn't that bad. And he was like, that's not what I was saying. And I was like, I know you didn't mean to say that, but you just took a passage about extreme sexual violence and explained it away and said there's nothing much to see here. And this is my long-winded way of saying that was a big deal to me, because that's when it sort of clicked for me what feminist scholars and queer theorists have been saying for a long time about how society works, but that when you have reading cultures like churches that make a practice of downplaying, explaining away, or ignoring passages in their text that are depictions of violence and sexism against women, and their approach is, there's nothing really to see here, it's not that big of a deal, maybe they deserved it, what, people shouldn't talk about this too much. That's not just an exercise in reading a text. That is actively creating in that room of people a sensitivity or a habit or an expectation of looking at sexual violence and going, no big deal. Or maybe God's going to use this for good, or like whatever explanation it's going to be used. And like, that's an active creation. I was just trying to say, like, some people sort of roll their eyes when us feminist scholars talk about like the downsides and harms of these texts,
some people
depicting violence against women. But like, this is the mechanic, or one of the simple, like, things happen at deeper levels, but this is one of the simple mechanics of how this actively gets reproduced. Every time Bibles get read and people look at these passages and either overlook the violence, downplay it, ignore it, explain it away, blame the victim, any number of things you're going to do. And for me, like, stepping back, I know you asked Lynn this, but like, for me, being a feminist reader is everything that Lynn said, but something else Lynn also would say. She just had a lot to say, which is it's also being able to look at passages in the text and actually not try to turn biblical text into kind egalitarian text, but instead to be able to look at them and go, this is going on in the text and it's wrong. And one of the things we can do is not just toss it out, but actually use it as a resource in the sense of, what does it look like to resist this? Why would people imagine things this way? Well, it's wrong and it's sexist, but here's how we can unmake that because it was made. I don't mean to be preaching. I was just going to add that in, but like, that's sort of for me, like, since we're getting to the end of time, like, why some of this matters as a scholar socially as well. It's not just a nerdy exercise.
Right. No, that's important.
Something that I've said a million billion times, and I will say it again, is that, no, you're fine. Obviously, men, boys experience sexual abuse and sexual violence. No one is saying that they don't. I would never say that. I know men that have. Like, that's not what I'm getting at when I say this. It is not a surprise or a coincidence that it is men who wrote these texts and men that actually don't have a lot of issues saying, like, yeah, it's not that big of a deal, because it's also men that, like, at large can't conceptualize what it's like to be the victim in that situation, or to be the person that would be the spoils of war, or to walk down the street right now and worry that, like, some guy could pull you into an alley, or someone more likely that can sexually assault you because they're bigger and stronger. And like, I've been having this conversation with people where it's obviously empathetic men can try and put themselves in those situations, or men that have experienced that abuse. But like, this lived reality of women, that's often just the hypothetical of men. It's a lot easier when it's hypothetical to just be like, yeah, like, it's not that bad. Like, I mean, I hear it in apologetic circles all the time. It makes me want to Oedipus Rex my eyes out. Because they'll say things like, well, actually, this was like the better option, right? It was more compassionate that they like took them and made them their wives. I'm like, they shaved their heads, murdered their entire family, said like, here's a month to mourn, and then took them home and effectively raped them for the rest of their lives.
Yeah.
You're saying that's the best God could do?
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry.
Yeah. I would just nuance that by saying that it's, cisgendered heterosexual men, given, the violence against trans people. Yeah. And it's just, but it does sort of raise the question. Yeah. I mean, like, who authored these texts? I mean, we just clearly, it is, in the hands of sort of the powerful who are kind of writing these from this perspective.
Yeah. So before, I don't know how much time everyone has. I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I would like to discuss my girl, the Whore of Babylon, and maybe talk a little bit about like what sort of literary role she's playing, what she might actually be representing, just really any of your thoughts on her.
I want to listen to you on this, Lynn.
Yeah. Well, I mean, clearly. So I say clearly. I mean, the image of Babylon is representing a city, and the city of Rome. But yeah, we have John using drawing upon Roman misogyny and Roman biased against sex workers to depict Rome. And I think he's doing it in part because Rome imagines itself as pure and wonderful, and often, sort of a common image of a common way of sort of understanding Rome is as the goddess Roma. And Rome also is home, like right in the center of the Forum of Rome, are the Vestal Virgins, who are sort of physical embodiments of the city. Their virginity is so precious that if their virginity is violated, if they are essentially raped, they are buried alive. So Rome really values its sort of image as sort of a virginal, chaste woman. And so John is totally pulling out all the misogyny and bias he can to image Rome. But so I do have a piece where I'm I'm fascinated by the image, and I'm fascinated by the image of Babylon in part as a queer woman. And knowing that sex workers today are often queer, or they're queering sex in ways. So I also think it's a real powerful image, right? On one hand, John is trying to do his best to slander Rome. On the other hand, he's created this image of this really kick-ass woman who owns her sexual power, who has the kings of the earth, she's riding them, right? And yeah, I mean, it's so it's this whole idea that sometimes texts undo themselves, right? And so he's trying to create an image that turns people off while simultaneously creating an image that a lot of people find fascinating. And she gets a lot of attention in visual representations of Revelation. So I don't know. Yeah. It's fascinating. I love talking about Babylon.
It's also really interesting to me, and you just said this basically, but John's doing what he can to create this image of this horrible, the worst sort of person or thing. But then in doing all of that, makes her this incredibly powerful character, and the only person that can defeat her is Jesus. Right? So it's this interesting thing where it's yeah, you are saying she's this horrible, evil person, but you're also attributing to her so much power that apparently none of the men on earth can stand up to. So it's it's just interesting.
Yeah. Well, it's where, so in the end, right? So then we have another sort of horrible image of sexual violence. Yes, it's a woman. I mean, it's a city, it's a metaphor, but John is depicting, it's God who puts it in the hearts of the kings of the earth to, devour, cannibalize. Strip her naked. I mean, it's an image of sexual violence and just horror towards Babylon. And it's, it is only, though, like you said, it's only the divine that, they put it in the hearts of humans. But I don't know. It's a really, the image of one thing, the image has a lot of, it sort of outlives Revelation, right? So one of the things I think is fascinating is that a lot of people will talk about Babylon. So people will talk about, prostitutes of Babylon, or they'll talk, so the image has been almost disconnected from Revelation, which I think is fascinating. The text is, that image is probably more popular than Revelation itself. Yeah. So
absolutely.
John loses.
Suck it, John.
So
Stephen?
No, I mean, That's everything I would have wanted to say now about Babylon. I was going to add one thing though, or to amplify something. Lynn mentioned this idea of like, on the one hand, Jill talked about the writer of Revelation constructs Babylon, like loading her with every sort of sexual gender slander he can to dunk on, or whatever term we want to use, on Rome. But then, as you said, like, it can sort of undo itself. One thing I've appreciated, and I just thought I'd mention this for people, for the viewers here, is that one of the cool movements in scholarship on Revelation recently, especially among feminist scholars, has been sort of exploring ways that various parts of the text do what Lynn was just describing with Babylon. If anyone needs to look this up, I would strongly encourage you to follow Lynn Huber on Twitter. Maybe you could put your handle in there, because she's been doing a series on women scholars of Revelation for the last month. And a lot of the pieces she's been highlighting are ones that explore this. So, for example, one of the articles she brought up was Love Seacrest's article on.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And, on. Why is my brain blanking out?
It's on the mother of harlots.
Yeah, in Revelation 12. And like, scholars classically look at scholars classically look at the woman of Revelation 12 as like, okay, even though she's a good guy in the text, sort of, she's still completely passive, like ancient constructions of femininity. And Love goes through and highlights ways that, yeah, that's true, but also there are aspects of the text that are actually undoing this too, and sort of generating these really important readings throughout history. I'm rambling on. I think that's really fascinating work, is where I was going with that.
Which I've been bad about the last couple of days. I haven't posted.
You've only been doing it for a whole month so far.
I just there are so many people who are women who do scholarship on Revelation. It's really amazing. Like, so sometimes you see bibliographies of people doing scholarship on Revelation, and there are no women mentioned, and it's like a person almost would have to like purposefully avoid citing a woman. What? I mean, I'm not.
Men would do that.
I'm not. It's just the people that get highlighted are always men, but there are so many, and I'm not the first person to make this observation. There's a feminist companion to the Apocalypse that A.J. Levine edited, like in 2004, I think, or something like that. And in it, she mentions that when she was starting in SBL, the Society of Biblical Literature, she was astounded by all the women in the field. That somehow women were drawn to the text, and it continues to be that today. Like, there are so many women scholars of Revelation, but still, and sometimes they don't get, we're not getting recognized. And
I mean, I asked on how I found you, is I asked on Twitter what scholars are working on Revelation. And honestly, of course, everybody was like, have you heard of Bart Ehrman? Like, yeah. Thank you. I have heard of him.
Like, I wasn't to insult him. It's just there have been other people, especially women scholars, working on the text a long time before.
No. So Bart Ehrman played a pivotal role in me getting the hell out of evangelicalism. But he's great. Don't get me wrong. This is not a diss on Bart Ehrman. I think he's great. But there are so many other people that I hadn't heard of, even though I actively look for people, just because it's not what pulls up to the top, unfortunately.
No, it's true. So so it's good to so I mean, I'm trying to shout out some women, and I'm not getting to everybody, and I'm not being very, I should have been more intentional about it.
If I can say this as a fellow dorky nerd, you were doing an amazing
thanks.
Service.
Half the time I'm like tweeting without my glasses on, and so there's like a billion. I don't know about anybody else, but I like to tweet without any glasses.
I just tweet with no filter. It's almost the same. This is Lynn's handle, just FYI. You all probably picked up on that, but you should definitely go follow her. Go take a look.
Susan has a handle too.
He does.
Not as important right here, though.
He does. But this, and I will put that in the show notes, but I want people to, if they're looking for scholars of Revelation, I really want them to go look at the list you put out, because I think I wrote down like 15 people that I hadn't even heard of, that are doing really interesting work. And I think especially, I mean, I am by no means like, again, not a scholar, nothing like that, just someone who's been deconstructing for the last 10 years. I'm still realizing how much my sort of theology as a Christian and then also my deconstruction has largely been informed by white men, and how they, and a lot of it's really good, but like there are so many other perspectives, and those are important perspectives. So when we're deconstructing, we're also decolonizing, and looking at things not just from a straight heterosexual sort of male perspective, as much as possible.
Right. And I will say too, Revelation also has, I mean, and we have a lot of scholars who are scholars of color who are writing from perspectives that, again, like a queer hermeneutics, we do, you know, people are also writing from other sort of contextualized perspectives. And there's some really interesting work being done. And I think, I don't know, Revelation, I think, tends to invite people bringing their context into the text, maybe in a different way. So
Lynn, if I could actually ask you a quick question here, since a lot of readers of whatever biblical literature, they'll often, not everyone, but going to commentaries is a common place that especially like Bible study leaders or ministers go. Do you have a commentary you could recommend by a non-white scholar that would allow people to, like, I know there are some, I'm just curious whom you might recommend for like a non-white scholar writing on Revelation who has a commentary or book that people can just, I want to know what this passage says, and they,
Yeah. So, I mean, so Brian Blunt has a commentary on Revelation, part of the new international
Interpreter, I think, right?
What was that?
The New Interpreter Bible series? I forget.
Yeah, I can't remember the name. It's got a purple cover, purple, which I like purple. So yeah. So, I mean, out of the commentaries on Revelation, they're primarily written by white men. Brian Blunt's is an exception. I have one coming out, hopefully in the fall. But there is an early commentary by Massingbird Ford, a woman, but it's a little eccentric in terms of its perspective on Revelation. But there's an older feminist commentary by Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza that people can often buy used. But yeah, in terms of commentaries, they're almost all by white men. But
are we able to pre-order yours or not yet?
I don't think so. I don't think yet.
Okay.
It's part of the Wisdom series, which is Liturgical Press. So Liturgical Press has been putting together this series for a number of years. And I will say, I mean, yeah, it's I can't even remember. Yeah, it's taking a little while. So I had started the project with my mentor, Gail O'Day, who used to be the dean at Wake Forest Divinity School, and she passed away. And so while kind of right at the beginning of our project, and so that has taken a little time. So
fair enough. Okay, so I would like to be respectful of y'all's time. I know it's much later where you guys are than where I am. We did get a couple of questions, so I just want to run through those quickly, and then I'll give you guys a few minutes to let everyone know where they can find you, how they can support you, how to stay in touch, where they can send cookies, etc., etc. Okay. Could Revelation be a metaphor for the constant struggles of humanity? Yes.
I would say, like, I mean, one of the things that people talk about, like Adela Yarbrough Collins, to talk about another like women scholar Revelation, is it does talk about the sort of cosmic myth that is a struggle between good and evil, right? And it translates that myth, which is pre-New Testament, into kind of New Testament terms. So there is that sense of this constant struggle in there between sort of binary, evil, good. Although I do think Revelation kind of complicates that binary. But there is definitely that kind of reading. And I think that that's one way of thinking about it, that, about some of these also the sort of perennial struggles of living with an empire, living in a world where there is environmental degradation, where there are things like earthquakes, which is particularly poignant thinking about the earthquakes in Turkey recently, Revelation being written in Turkey, and there's all of this earthquake imagery, right? So these are perennial things. So I do think our DNA had something there.
I think it might be worth, sorry to interrupt, we had talked about this a bit pre-show, and I know we don't have a lot of time, but this sort of the way that evangelical Christians read Revelation today is really damaging, not just to people within the faith, but to the way in which they treat their environment and everything else, right? So it lends itself to this sort of eco-fascism, because if the world is going to end, what does it matter if there's global warming, right? And some people even think that global warming, it's like welcoming sort of the end, right? So even beyond not helping prevent it, they're sort of actively like happy to contribute to it. So
so Revelation really gets read that way. And Stephen, before you got on with us, I was mentioning how James Watt, Secretary of the Interior or the Environment back under Reagan, was an evangelical Christian who thought Jesus was going to return. And so thought that environmental protection was not necessary, right? Environmental, one of the things we haven't talked about, which we should, I'd love to talk with you some other time, is just the way sort of apocalyptic thinking impacts U.S. politics because of the prevalence of white evangelical, primarily men in sort of United States politics, right? So apocalyptic thinking shapes U.S. policy on the environment, on geopolitical decisions, sort of support of Israel, things like this.
Oh God, yeah, I would love to have that conversation.
So I'm being a nerd because I'm sitting in my office, although it's a home office, so this is also technically the master bedroom of our house, which we use as my office and for storing clothes and for cute little stuffed animals like that back there. So I'm just picking up books. I was going to say I don't actually know this scholar I just read. It was a book about, I don't know if y'all, Lynn, if you've seen this book here.
Skepticism.
I think I have. I can't remember who's the author.
Robin Veldman.
Oh yeah, no.
I don't know this scholar. What I was going to get at is might be worth looking into, because it'd be a fascinating conversation. Because one of the things this book does is it explores from a sociological, ethnographical vantage point, trying to ask to what extent do these apocalyptic schemes and ideas influence climate change denial among not all evangelicals, but certain swaths of them. And so actually, I know you mentioned, Jessica, that you were thinking of maybe doing a series on Revelation. I completely second what Lynn is suggesting here. I think that would be a really fascinating discussion to get.
There's a scholar, his name is Micah Keel, who has a book on apocalyptic ecology, and his last name is Kiel, and he talks also about environmental degradation was happening during the Roman Empire. It's one of the realities of imperial growth is the need to destroy the land, and exploit resources of especially of other countries, right? Or of other nations and places that you colonize. And so, he talks a lot about the mines and sort of Roman, destruction of the earth. So, I mean, yeah, I don't know.
And we see this all the way back into like ancient Mesopotamia, where we have the kings who are trying to figure out how to structure their like conquered nations, and basically what they're doing is just taking all of their the resources they need in the city and funneling them into the city, which was ultimately not a great strategy, but yeah, you see this sort of constant and damn near feels eternal exploitation of outside resources, or what they consider outside resources, for the growth and sort of continuation of empire.
Just on that, my students in my mythology class the other week, we were reading, I assigned them part of book 1 of Ovid's Metamorphoses. Of interest here, Ovid is a Roman poet from the 1st century. He reproduces a common myth in ancient writers that, hey, there were 4 different races or ages of humanity, although 5, yeah, some of them, gold, silver, bronze, then iron, although there's a heroic race for some of them too. But in Ovid's scheme of this myth, one of the signs, my students really dug into this. It was interesting that y'all are bringing this up because they were asking questions about climate stuff. Is when Ovid gets to the Iron Age, one of his innovations, it looks like, compared to at least some of the earlier written sources we have, as he stresses that in the Iron Age, this is when these dumbasses, people are like taking trees off of mountains that are supposed to be on mountains. They're putting them in the ocean to go do commerce. And the last thing he says is he mocks people for mining, like digging into the earth and destroying it and pulling out mining stuff. And my students are really digging into this, asking the types of questions y'all are asking. And then I, of course, being the jerk professor I am, complicated it by saying, well, do we think this is really Ovid trying to take a stand against empire, since he is personally quite wealthy and benefiting from all of these things? But having said that, it was still like, as you were bringing up with Micah Keel, these themes are explored throughout a variety of ancient sources, and I think it'd be really cool if my students were talking about it for a bit. So I'm sure people would love to come here and talk about it for longer.
Yeah, I mean, I would love. I don't know if this is how possible this is, but like I've been obsessed with sort of the evolution of apocalyptic thought over like the Old Testament into the New Testament. And I talked about it at my sister's wedding over dinner for like 45 minutes to a bunch of people that
I was hoping that was part of the toast.
Yeah, like I was sitting there drinking tequila and like, listen, I'm going to tell you how hell evolved. But like that into, hi Charlie, what you guys are talking about, how that impacts sort of climate and all of that. And I would totally love to do that. And if we know of any other scholars that you think I could get to come on and talk about it, let me know.
I will.
Thank you. Okay. Next question. This is actually the last question, so no worries. For the panel, has the exposure on new entertainment and various media gotten better over the last decade for queer and feminist perspectives on religion and morality?
That's a big one. I mean, I don't know. Sometimes people think exposure is all, some people argue all exposure at all is good, right? Like any exposure is good exposure. And I don't know. I think there's some really great stuff happening on social media around thinking about queer perspectives on religion, morality. I have a student who's just written an undergraduate thesis on, queer representations of Jesus on TikTok.
Jesus.
Yes. Yeah. And
that's my friend.
Oh yeah. Yeah. So I mean, yeah. So she is looking at this and, I think, I mean, there's interesting avenues for, especially with social media, for connecting and sharing queer and feminist perspectives and experiences, right? And I think especially right now where we have like all of this anti-trans legislation, we have folks really trying to censor what kids can access. I'm like all about like we need to be getting our kids on social media so that they can learn about queer and trans experience, and that these are ways of being and important. I don't know. I just remember being a kid in high school when somebody first called me lesbian, and I had to go look up the word in the dictionary because I didn't know what it was. And you know, like today, people, there's so much more information available, and I think that that's a good thing. So it comes with dangers, especially for queer and trans people, but it can be a good thing to at least have access to community and knowing that there are other people out there.
Sorry, Charlie's trying to take over the show.
Charlie's
It's dinner
like-
time, so
Charlie's
he's like, let's.
You all need to wrap it up.
Yeah, he's like, and my dinner is not in my bowl. Yeah, don't worry, I'll get you some soon. All right, those are all the questions that we had. So I'm going to give y'all a chance for some final thoughts, anything you have to say, and then let folks know where they can find you, how they can support you. Yeah, anything else you want to tell them?
I'll go first because I'd love for Lynn to have the final thing to say here. No. I'm just saying, like, you thought about this longer than I have. So yeah, I'm, as you mentioned before, I'm Stephen Young. You can find me online. My good and particularly bad moments probably at Sly Professor on Twitter.
He's an excellent follow. If you like me, you'll like him.
Really? No.
You're welcome.
I don't really know exactly what else to add. In terms of supporting me, what you can do is ask yourself, what way in my life in the coming week can I show substantive support to LGBTQ humans around us? Because they're going through some stuff right now. So be an ally. Yeah. I feel like really superficial saying that, but there's nothing really concrete. Yeah. Do that, please. And yeah.
I'd second that. I second that. And yeah, and you can find me at lhuber01 on Twitter, and I have a webpage, lynnrhuber.com, which is really boring. But it's there. So yeah, and thank you. This has been lovely.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for being willing. When I told people you were coming on, everybody was like, she agreed to come on your channel. I'm like, yes, I don't know. I've told everybody.
There's something to do.
Yeah, come on, guys.
I live in Burlington, Stephen. You know, what's there to do? I live in Burlington. There's not much to do. I can go to the carousel or...
Yeah, there's a parking lot by the RJ Reynolds outlet. And so my dad learned how to drive back in the day, apparently.
Oh. You mean the JR outlet?
JR, sorry, yeah, JR.
My spouse loves JRs because they are, you know, it's the largest humidor in the United States.
What?
Like it really is there?
They have cigars. Yeah, no, it's the largest humidor.
I don't know what a humidor is.
It's what you keep cigars in to keep them moist.
Okay.
Yeah.
And it's like a whole big, yeah.
I just call it, sorry, RJ, yeah, JR. Yeah, it's, and by the way, those all have no idea what we're talking about. If you drive I-40 through Burlington, you see this very large on the side of the road. And anyway,
I have to admit, I am only, like, I visited some states. I visited, like, one state on the East Coast.
Yeah.
So, but soon.
I'm from Oregon, so I always say West Coast, best coast.
Yeah, I agree. Hard agree.
I'm from Greensboro. It's right here. So I'm surprised I got to end up here in the long run because most of us academics don't usually really get to choose where we live. Anyway, thank you again for organizing this.
My pleasure. Thank you both so much. I am in your debt. I have learned a lot. I know everybody in the chat is saying thank you and they appreciate it and they've learned a bunch. And we'll definitely have to set something up again soon because I am not, contrary to popular belief, a social person. So this is like my social hour because I only want to talk about very specific things. All right. So on that note, y'all be good or be good at it. Stay chaotic and go be an ally and an advocate for someone less privileged than you. And on that note, I'll see y'all next time. Bye. Hopefully Correa's in here to end the show. Maybe not.
Oh shit. You done fucked up now. Ain't nothing but a gangster party.